So moving forward, we got our actual speaker, Mr. Marc Thurston. Bring him up here. Let's get a round of applause.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me back. Every year I look forward to this venue and this meeting. It's one of my favorites of the year. Before I get started this year and diving into the data and my presentation, I've actually got to get something off my chest. Because as we know, everything that is old becomes new again, and certainly in a new real estate cycle that we currently find ourselves in, things that we thought disappeared back in 2013, 2014 have resurfaced, and they're a little bit annoying. So I just got to voice my concerns here, and then we will move on today. So the first one is recently I have been receiving a lot of phone calls from brokers as well as buyers directly who they only have one question, and the question just cuts to the chase. They just go, well, I don't care about anything about financials on the property. I just want to know, what's the seller's bottom line? And as I told the audience back in 2014 when I was standing at this podium, my answer is I truly don't know, because in 33 years, I've never asked a seller that question, and I certainly don't intend to start asking at this point. So if you have a client that says, hey, we understand that you're friends with Marc, and you go, yeah, I'm friends with Marc, and they go, well, call him up and ask him what they'll take. You are happy to call me up. We'll talk about the weather. We can talk about your business, and we can debate the merits of whether we think the new Corvette body looks like a Ferrari, but we are not going to talk about price. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is I'm getting a lot of new agents as well as out of area agents who are calling me, and they'll call me up, and this will be our first conversation, and they'll go, Marc, my client loves your property at 123 Main Street. And I'll go, fantastic, that's great. They go, so we would like to know what time on Sunday morning we can show those units. Now, I'm trying to be professional about it, and I always respond the same way and say, well, I'm sorry, it's tenant occupied. You've got to make an offer. Once your offer is accepted, you've got 17 days due diligence to determine whether or not it meets your investment criteria. Now, about 50% of that audience or those people will go, okay, and they'll move on. But there's another 50% that goes, oh, my client's going to be so disappointed. And I try to maintain, and one of these days, I'm just afraid my alter ego is going to lose it. And what I'm going to say back to them is, oh, you're sad. I'm sad because you told me your client loved my property, and yet you're not calling to talk to me about income and expenses. You're not talking to me about the age of the roof or when the HVACs were last replaced, and you're not asking me about the parking lot. Instead, all you're concerned about is the color of the paint on the walls, which means absolutely nothing as far as the investment return goes. So, okay, we can move on now. So, last year, our total sales volume was 143 million, which is up 19% over the previous year. We are at 1,129 units sold, which was actually a decrease of 6% over the previous market. Gross rent multipliers now stand at 12.06, up from 11.21, so pretty significant increase for the year. Cap rates, the average cap rate last year was 4.34%. We did see cap rates range from 1.8% all the way up to 10.7%. This particular graph here, so the three lines are illustrating the average price per unit in the market. The top line here, this one right here, that represents the four-plex market. The blue line represents the average, and the gray line here represents the 5-unit or the buildings with 5+ units. And so as you could easily see, the first 2 quarters, obviously the market was going up. We get into the third quarter, we start to see values decline. kind of towards the end of the year, there were a couple of really strong fourplex transactions, which pushed that market up, plus the fact that there were very few transactions. So it didn't take very many to influence the direction of the market. The average market obviously was flat throughout the year. And then the 5+ units had a decline at the end of the year. It's not surprising on the 5+ units, because if you think about it, those particular owners are probably more experienced, and they are definitely going to be more interest rate sensitive than a new investor that this is their first go around, and they're happy with whatever rate they can get. So average price per unit in the fourplex market, it increased for the 11th year in a row. We are now at $134,000. The 5 to 30 unit market was up 22% to $108,000. And then the big winner last year was the 31+ unit category, which was up 25%, finishing the year at $108,000. Or actually $114,000, I'm sorry. The overall average price per unit in the market last year, we ended up at $125,221. It represents a 15.38% price appreciation last year, which is pretty remarkable given how slow the second half of the year was. The 65% of the sales last year actually occurred in the first 6 months. So definitely the last half was much slower. The overall average, if we look at kind of a macro picture of this market, the overall average for the last 20 years now stands at 6.7% appreciation in the multifamily. So this particular slide, how far has the market recovered? As you can clearly see on here, we broke every single record last year. So given how slow the market is starting this year, the title of this might be changed: how far has the market fallen next year when I appear? Citywide vacancy. So the first quarter, we started the year at 1.57% vacancy. We dropped in the second quarter to 1.38%, which is normal. Historically, the second quarter for Bakersfield is your best rental market. So if you're not going down in that quarter, then the rest of the year is probably not going to be very good. The third quarter, we ended up at 1.79% vacancy, and then the fourth quarter at 2.54%. In 2021, you will recall, I let everybody know last year our rent growth averaged 14%. In 2022, the rent growth dropped to 8%. And what was really interesting is in the third quarter of the year, 95% of all the buildings that are now charging in excess of $2,000 rents, they had at least one unit size drop that rent. So it says to me that Class A, $2,000 plus rent has met the ceiling, and we're now starting to see pushback in those rents. So I think that's going to have kind of a long-term impact on new construction, and we're going to get into that here in just a minute. In the fourth quarter, though, what was interesting, before I move from the third quarter, also in the third quarter is, despite the fact that we had this decline in the Class A segments, the Class B and C segments, actually 75 buildings raised their rents during that period. And the reason for that, I believe, is because in August 1st, that's when they said statewide rent control in Bakersfield could go to 10%. And so I think a lot of those people that had Class B and Class C buildings decided, you know what, we need to try to catch up. And so they all got very aggressive with their rents, and they bumped them up. And so we saw that go up. So fast forward then to the fourth quarter, we had 35 buildings that reduced rent in the fourth quarter, of which a third of those were Class A. The other 2/3, surprisingly, were now Class B and a handful of Class Cs. And at the same time, though, the Class Ds decided to get with the ball, and we had 30 buildings raise their rent. So definitely you're starting to see this domino effect impact the rental market as we're starting to see, some pushback. And I think obviously it can be attributed to, inflationary pressures that the residents are feeling. and they're going, hey, rents have been growing at such a fast pace here, but obviously my salary has not been growing. And so as a result, the tenants are going, hey, I'm going to make other choices for my housing. And you're starting to see these landlords have to deal with this issue. I will comment, giving kind of a glimpse year to date. I've talked to a number of property managers, and everybody for the first 3 weeks of January seemed really excited because there was a lot of activity going on. But once we got through the third week, then all of a sudden it kind of slowed back down to what we had been seeing in the fourth quarter. So hard to say yet, what's going to ultimately happen for the remainder of the quarter and certainly for the remainder of the year. Finally, as far as the rental market goes, in my survey, where I survey roughly 102 buildings, 72 of them are now charging back for the common area utilities, which is known as RUBS. So that number now encompasses all of the major management companies in Bakersfield have now implemented that. So only, kind of a handful of those buildings that are self-managed are the only ones that have not gotten on board with that program. So new construction. Last year, 2 buildings were completed, totaling 326 units. There is currently 718 units under construction as we speak. And in the pipeline, this is the shocking part. There are 2,694 units in the development pipeline, meaning they are going through plan design. They're getting the prices bid out. They're trying to get permits. In addition to the 2,694 units, there's also 3 rent-to-own communities that are being built here in Bakersfield. This will be the first time I have heard of this in the Central Valley. Apparently, it's a very popular concept in Arizona and Texas, but it's now made its way to the Central Valley, and we will see, what happens and where that happens. And then finally, in the building cycle, so I mentioned, obviously we're seeing pushbacks in the Class A rents. 2 developers who were developing 548 units and had gotten to the point where it was time to actually write the check to the city or the county. They have decided to table their plans for the time being because they said, based upon the rising construction costs, the higher interest rates, as well as the softening in the rental market, they're just like, we're not willing to take on that type of risk right now. And so we're going to table the projects. I anticipate out of that 2,694 number, my guess is by the end of this year, you're going to see a lot of those projects get tabled. I think the only 2 developers that I think will continue to push forward will be, our 2 ex-carrot growers. They are going to continue to build, and just because they're building on different financial fundamentals than the typical developer merchant builder would be. So what am I suggesting to my clients? The first thing I'm going to do is address the sellers. If you have a compelling reason to sell, the market's softening, but if you look at the average price right now, because there's been so few comps since the beginning of the year, the average price right now still shows that we are higher than the average price was between 2007 to the spring of 2021. So if you need to sell, still a great time to sell. There are a lot of buyers out there, although obviously their expectations have changed. And their strategies for making offers have changed, but it's still a good market if you want to get a good price. As far as the buyers go, my recommendation to my buyers has been to be patient. I think that this expectation gap between buyer expectations and sellers' expectation is massive right now. I don't see that closing, at least anytime in the first 2 quarters. Maybe as we get to this 3rd and 4th quarter, if the Federal Reserve stops raising rates or slows that down to a trickle, maybe you'll start to see some of that gap narrow. But when you talk to a seller right now, they're looking at those comps that people were getting last spring, and they're all going, hey, that's the number I want. If you can't get me that number, I don't want to sell. And, that's just not the reality now, because buyers are going, hey, I'm no longer paying 3% or, interest rates. I'm now paying 5 or 6%. And so I can't afford to pay you that same type of price. And historically, if you look at the different real estate cycles, it's usually never the buyers that change the stance in this type of a market. It's always the sellers that come down to where the buyers are willing to pay. So it's going to take time. And if you think about it, one of the themes that I've touched on the previous 2 years, if you are a seller, truly, why would you be selling right now unless you have a compelling reason? Because, you're still getting strong rents. You still have, 2% vacancy. I mean, which historically is just unbelievable. And you more than likely have locked into a loan in the last 5 years. It's a really low interest rate loan. So, unless you have something to do with that money elsewise, there's not a lot of motivation to sell out there. So, I think that you need to be patient. Now, the two things that I am suggesting people keep an eye out for, if you can find a low interest rate loan that's got like 5 or 6 years left on the amortization, that might be a good opportunity to get into a deal at a really low interest rate, get some cash flow built up, and then refinance it, when that loan comes due. The other strategy I'm suggesting, which is still very prevalent in Bakersfield, despite the fact that, 75 buildings raised their rents in the third quarter, that is not the vast majority of buildings in Bakersfield. If you look around and you really study the rental market, you're going to recognize there's a lot of people with really low rents. And if you can find somebody that is willing to price it based on their rents, there are certainly opportunities there to come in and over the course of 3 to 4 years, get those rents built up and have a nice investment. So I think the takeaway, my expectation for the year, I'm not seeing a lot of volume. If you look at it year to date in Bakersfield, 5 or 4 units and above, there's only been 5 closed deals in the first, call it 50 days. So that's not exactly setting any records. And I think that that's going to kind of be the trend, at least through the first half of the year. We'll see in the second half of the year, what direction the market decides to head in. It's not, the one thing I want to make clear to everybody, it's not a lack of buyers, because I'll give you an example. So I recently, a lot of you saw those duplexes I had on Michelle and South Real. So on the Michelle duplex, I got 17 offers there. So clearly there's a lot of buyers. The difference is unlike a year ago getting 17 offers, I would say at least 8 or 9 of these offers basically just took the list price, cut it in half, didn't ask anything about the financials, didn't want to know anything about the building. They're just like, here's my discounted offer, 50% off, take it or leave it. Well, clearly, that's probably not going to fly. And I was talking with another agent here recently, and they were telling me that apparently there's a seminar group going around telling people just to make offers 50% off and throw as many of them out there as you can, because hopefully one day something will stick. So I don't know. Once again, everything that's old becomes new again. So here we find ourselves again. So for those of you who it's your first time joining us this year, every year I have what's called Mark's Soapbox, and I render an opinion on something on the market. This year I have 2 things that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to share with you guys some observations that I've made through the various real estate cycles. And then the last thing I'm going to share with you guys is a story of kindness and loyalty. And I think that if there's anything that we need in this world right now, it's certainly some more kindness. So the first thing I want to talk about here is I'm now gone through my 3rd cycle. So I'm at the beginning of my 4th cycle in real estate. So I've had an opportunity to see a lot of different events occur, certainly in a downward trending market. And I can tell you, I've made a lot of mistakes over the years. And so I thought that this morning might be a great opportunity to share with you guys some of those mistakes that I personally have made, so that maybe you can avoid those mistakes yourselves and make your life a little easier as we transition through this phase of the market. I have to assume that everybody in here who has a sales manager or a broker, probably within the last 50 days, has been told by your broker or your sales manager, we want you to go out there and go back to the basics. Now, I'm not going to talk about the basics. That's between you and your broker, and whatever that looks like to you, I'm not going to unpack that. But what I am going to talk about is 3 different things that I feel are as important as the basics, if not in some cases more important than the basics. So here we go. So the first one, short-term pain equals long-term gain. And really the overriding factor on this is your mental approach to the current cycle. You have to recognize, you know what, we're in a crappy part of the market. I mean, this is the downturn of the market. We certainly are not where we were a year ago when everything was just flying off the shelf. We're in a downturn. Okay. It is what it is. But the key here is not to dwell upon the short-term downturn part, even though we have no clue how long this is going to last. Is this 6 months or 6 years? Who knows? Nobody has a crystal ball. All we can do is stay focused on the horizon. And by focusing on the horizon, we will get through this short-term pain here. So my main thing, or my main message on this one is, keep a positive attitude. It's not fun. I know it, been there, but it will get better. And you've just got to make your mind up that you're going to survive and you will get through this. You will find a way to make it. The second thing about the mental approach is your ego. Now, I'm looking out in the room here, and I'm not going to point out any people or say any names or throw you under the bus, but there are some people in this room with big egos. We are sales professionals. There's also some people in this room that probably need more swagger because your clients expect your sales professionals to have a little bit of swagger. But one of the problems is in a down market, if you allow your ego to take over, it can make it very uncomfortable. And what ends up happening is you're constantly looking in the rear view mirror saying, but I'm not the down market guy, I'm the up market guy. And a great example of this would be the 2003 to 2008 market. I had some really productive years and I was way up here. And fortunately, I had enough in my pipeline that when everything collapsed in the third quarter of 2008, I was able to cruise through the end of 2008 and come out going, yeah, that wasn't so bad. But I get to 2009 and I get slapped upside the head because all of a sudden my production went from here way down here with everybody else's. And yet mentally, I'm still thinking I'm this guy. And because I had such a big ego at that point, I was going, well, I'm still me. I'm still doing the same things I was doing before, but I was failing to recognize, you know what? I had nothing to do with Shearson Lehman. I had nothing to do with Bear Stearns. I had nothing to do with the toxic mortgages, but their worldwide impact impacted everybody. And it took everybody down. And until I finally came to that conclusion and go, oh yeah, okay, maybe I was just the beneficiary of a hot market. It was a real struggle mentally through 2009, 2010. So definitely check your ego, look in the mirror and admit to yourself whether it was all you or whether the fact that, you know what, you were the beneficiary of a hot market. And certainly in my case, the last couple of years, that was certainly the case. The last thing I'm going to say about ego is try not to get sucked into the water cooler talk. We all know what it's like in an office. Everybody hangs out either at the front desk or by the water cooler, and you get the Debbie Downers in there that want to tell you how bad it is. And I think that the key here is you really want to focus on that horizon, and you want to surround yourself with people who have a positive outlook that are going to get through that. And if you look in this room, some of the people who have been with me through 3 cycles, and I know a couple of people in here have been through 4 or 5 cycles, those are the people you really want to gravitate to, because those are the people who know how to make it. They are survivors, and they will survive this one just as well. So the next self-reflection moment in looking in that mirror is, are you an order taker or are you a sales professional? And the reason I ask this, because I can tell you the last 3 years, I've been an order taker, because when all you have to do is put a listing out there and you have 3 offers within the first 24 hours, there is not a lot of sales professional skills necessary. And unfortunately, in a upward market, you never really get a chance to develop those skill sets. So for those of you who have been in the business since 2013, all you've ever known is an upswing, and that's great. And you can learn a lot, but you don't get the same opportunities as you do in a down market in order to develop that skill set. So my recommendation is at this point, if you don't think that you have that experience yet, and you are honest with yourself and say, you know what? Yeah, I'd love to develop that. Now is a time where you've got extra time. So say to yourself, you know what? An hour a day, I'm going to devote to reading a book. I'm going to watch a YouTube video. I'm going to listen to a podcast in order to become a better sales professional. Because the clientele now that is in the market, it's not the same clientele a year ago who just wanted to be in because their friends were in. The people that are now back in the market, these are people that need sales professionals because they need your skill set in order to get deals done. Because obviously with that disconnect, it takes a whole lot more effort than it does when you just have to write an offer and get it accepted. So take the time, make the commitment, and try to improve that. The last thing about being a sales professional, and we've got some great examples in our community here. If you look at the Mark Smiths, the Scott Underhills, the Dwayne Keithleys, the Wayne Cresses, the Phil Fontes, if you look at that group of brokers, I mean, those guys are, they are the rock stars of the industry. And not only do they have great sets of sales professional skills, but one of the main things that they possess is they possess in-depth knowledge on their specific markets. They are truly experts. And, that to me is what really kind of separates the great agents from everybody else. Is they've spent the time and the effort to really go deep, and they know something better than everyone else. And so I would suggest that that's another thing that you can do during a down market. You got extra time, study the market, look at the past, look at what's going on, look at the inventory, not necessarily of what's on the market, but what's out there, and learn the inventory, learn the rents, and learn that information. And one of the things that I would tell you as a self-test, so everybody in here who has had a listing has probably had an appraiser call them and say, hey, we'd like information on your sales comps. And that's great. And by all means, if you get a call from an appraiser, you should return that call as quickly as possible and give them as much help as you can. And that's wonderful. But the real test that you need to ask yourself, if you're considered an expert, are the appraisers calling you not for a specific comp, but they're calling to talk to you about the market in general? When they start making those calls to you on a quarterly basis to try to find out what's going on in the market, what are you hearing, what deals are you seeing, what are the buyer expectations, what are the sellers, that's when you know you are now considered an expert within the industry. So this is a great time to try to develop that skill set as we move forward. The last thing is put on your own mask. And, I think in this business, in a good market, this business can be brutal to all of us, both mentally and physically wearing you out. But in a bad market, man, that just really gets compounded because, now is not only are you exhausted, but now you've got all this negative energy around you by, people in your company and, the clients that are going, oh my God, the sky is falling. And so it is very tough to maintain a positive attitude in this. And so it has taken me literally decades to come to this realization that you've got to really look out for yourself first in order to be a value to your clients. And, going back to that same period I just mentioned a minute ago, the 03 to 08, so at that time, my wife and I, we didn't have a child at that point. We were both workaholics, and we would just every day, we were in the office before 7 a.m. and we wouldn't go home until 6 p.m. And I remember Michael Friedman used to joke with me. He'd go, Mark, what do you mean you don't work weekends? And I'd give him some lame excuse. Well, I'm a commercial agent. We don't work weekends. And Michael would always give me a hard time. And yet the reality was, yeah, I didn't work weekends as far as with clients. And I dang sure was not working weekends with other brokers, but I would still find myself down at the office trying to learn the market and try to get caught up on paperwork. And that was an everyday deal. And even though I hated to see the market end in 2008, it was kind of a breath of fresh air because I realized wow, I don't need to be here 6.5 days a week. There's a life out there. And so I have slowly over the years, taken more time for myself and my family. And so just within this last year, though, this whole concept of putting your mask on first really resonated with me. And so, what that means to me is, you got to take care of your health, you got to take care of your nutrition, and you got to give yourself permission to have a mental break from this business, because this business will eat you up. And so if you're going to be of value to your clients, be value to your loved ones and to your friends, put your mask on first. And right now is a great time to develop those habits now while you have time, before the market gets heated up again and we've all, going back to craziness again. So the last thing I'm going to finish here today is a story. For those of you who have been with me before, typically at this point, I usually share a funny video, but unfortunately, I don't get a chance to watch very much of TV or movies anymore. Now that I have a 5-year-old, that's kind of out the window. And so usually I try, if I can't share a video, I like to share a war story, but I don't have any good war stories from this last year. So this year, I'm actually going to share a story of what I perceive to be kindness and loyalty. So there was a gentleman who started buying properties here in Bakersfield in the early 90s. He started with a duplex in Oildale. As of last night, I heard, this same gentleman now has 25,000 units in 12 different states. He is in the top 75 largest apartment owners now in the country. So basically, you can almost say in the world. And so I met this gentleman 1997. We were roughly the same age and we hit it off really well. And since then, I probably have transacted maybe 30 transactions for him. But a watershed moment occurred in 2006. He had been very successful here locally, and he decided to take his show on the road and start expanding nationally. And so he came to me and he says, look, Mark, he says, I've got an opportunity to buy this $12 million building, but I don't have any money. So he goes, who do you know that could help me? And so I ended up introducing him to his first 4 partners, who are still his partners to this day. And so they funded him, and that kind of launched him into this whole different stratosphere. And so we've continued to do business together. We've become very good friends, and I consider him a mentor and certainly a role model. Well, he calls me up last spring, and he's sounding really down, and we probably talk every 6 weeks or so. And so usually he's very high energy, you can just see the smile coming through the telephone, but he was really down. And so I'm like, hey, what's going on? And he says, man, he said, Dottie just died. And I'm like, oh, geez, because Dottie, I knew to be the very first on-site manager that he hired back in 1992. And this lady was still his manager, or well, up to that point, she was still his manager. And I was just like, oh man, because this building was his first medium-sized building. She was his first manager. She had been on this property 14 years prior to him purchasing it. And now she's gone. And he was just torn up about it. And he says, yeah, he says, she was such a great friend and such a loyal employee. He says that she literally collected rents on Saturday, did all the bank deposit slips, wrote us out notes on every resident, laid her pin down, and died at her desk. So all the way to the end. And you could just tell, he was just devastated. And so he says to me, he goes, yeah, he says, we're going to have a service for her here in a couple of weeks. Her family's going to come out from Southeast United States. And he says, they're going to clean her unit out. And he says, once that's all done, he says, I think I'll be ready to sell this property. And I go, okay, hey, not a problem. And he says, well, I wanted you to know the reason I've never sold it is, he says, because I promised Dottie that I would never sell this building as long as she lived here. So despite whatever the market was doing, that it was never going to happen. And so I was just blown away by that type of loyalty that you would see from an employer to an employee. It was just just amazing, and the love he had for this employee. But it didn't stop there. So he says to me, he goes, he says, I own this building separately from my company. He said, so my dad, who's in his 80s, he manages it with my manager. And he goes, I just left it up to them to deal with the rents. And he said, so you're probably going to find the rents really, really low on this one. And I'm like, okay, not a problem. So I run the analysis. I call him up the next day and I said, hey, this, based on your rents and based on where interest rates were at the time, I said, this is what I think the value is. And he's like, okay. And I said, this spring, because the market has been so active, I said, we've had really good success going in and taking low rents, serving them the legal rent permitted increases. And then actually, even though those rents haven't taken effect yet, the notices are good enough for us to base the sales price on. And I said, as a result of that, I said, we can get you another $300,000. And before I could get that out of my mouth, he's like, no, Mark. He goes, my residents just lost the only manager they have ever known. And not only was she their manager, she was the mother to most of them. She was their best friend. And there's no way that I'm going to go in there and be the asshole landlord that's going to give them a rent increase just so I can turn around a week later and sell the building to somebody else. And I'm just like, whoa, okay. I mean, just blown away by not only the loyalty to his employee, but to his customers. And so it just speaks volumes of who he is as a person and the type of person that you want to try to strive for. And I can tell you, so last night he was actually in town for an event. Myself and Karen were there. And his 4 people have now grown, just counting the local people only. We were at 225 people there last night. And I think it's because the way he treats his partners, the way he treats his employees, and the way he treats his customers is a great lesson for all of us to learn moving forward. So thank you very much. If anybody has any questions on the market, I'm happy to try to answer. Thank you. Robin? The way that they're implementing that is, basically most of the companies are implementing it on turnovers. So it's very difficult to go in as an individual and just say, hey, you know what? You're now going to start paying RUBS, because they're not going to understand it. So what I'm finding is most of the management companies that have had success with it, that's something that when somebody walks in the door and they go, okay, well, your rent's going to be $1,500, but you're also going to be paying RUBS in addition to that, which is your pro rata share of those common area utilities. So it would be unusual, at least in Bakersfield. I can't speak for like Los Angeles or the Bay Area, but it would be unusual here to, just blanket serve everybody notice and say, okay, by the way, you're also paying RUBS on top of that 10% rent increase, because that's not permitted, because the state of California looks at RUBS as part of the rent. And so, you can't do 10% plus RUBS at the same time. You've got to implement the RUBS. And then, a year from there, then you start going up with the, whatever the allowable increases are, which, based on cost of living right now, it looks like we'll probably get a second year of 10%. I just don't know that within our market, they will be able to afford to pay that. So any other questions? Yes.
Are you seeing an increase in like creative financing on deals? Seller financing or all inclusive trustees, things like that?
I haven't seen any deals done that way, but I have had a lot of buyers, and many of the people that are saying, hey, we want 50% off the price. They want 50% off the price, plus they want seller financing. So I'm seeing that request. I just don't know that those deals are going to get done anytime soon, because I don't know that I don't know mentally that the sellers are prepared to do that. So we'll see. That is the $1 million question. And I will tell you guys this. So I was told about this rent to own concept by a very prominent person in our community. But what was weird is he would not disclose to me the parties that are doing it, nor would he necessarily disclose, except for to say maybe Southwest Bakersfield that they're going to go into. So it's being kept really hush-hush at this point. And I mean, that's a great question. My concern is the person that could pay, call it that $2,000 or $2,500 rent, are they really going to want to live in an all rental neighborhood without ever knowing when their neighbors are going to be in a position to actually buy the place? So I'm going to be as fascinated as everybody else to watch this and go, okay, how is this going to work? But what scares me about it is, we've already got, call it 750 units coming online in 2023. And now we're going to bring these 3 completely mystery rent to own house type thing on the market. Well, when he was telling me about it, he wouldn't tell me how many of those 3 were going to be. So are we talking another 500 living units on top of this? Are we talking 1,000 units? I mean, so it remains to be seen. And, certainly I would throw it out there. If anybody in this audience ends up knowing about it or coming across that information, by all means, drop me a line, send me an email, get a hold of me. I definitely want to talk to you about this, because I'm at a loss on this one. Yeah, I mean, what a fascinating approach to try to stimulate sales. I don't know. So I'm stumped on that one. Any other question? Yes. So he asked if there's any data on foreclosures or bank-owned stuff. So I'm not aware of anything that's heading back at this point. The reality is, we saw middle of last summer into the fall, you started to see some of these loans that people were doing interest only on, and they didn't really have a good cap on them. And so what ended up happening is, when the rates started adjusting, all of a sudden these people that thought they had a 2 or 3% loan, now all of a sudden have a 5 or 6% loan, and yet they've told their partners that their pro forma is going to be, this really positive return. And all of a sudden now they're no longer making distributions to their partnerships, and those people are panicking. And I think that there have been some of those scenarios occur. The saving grace for all of those guys is the values have gone up so much that there's typically an equity position in them for them either to refinance, or they can come back and say, you know what, maybe this just isn't the deal for me. And we'll get it sold. So for example, the gentleman I was sharing the story about there at the end, in the last 18 months, he basically had 9, what he called the dogs of the portfolio. So he had 9 buildings that were the buildings that, take all your time, the buildings that aren't getting the projections you originally anticipated. And he basically went through and they culled the portfolio of that and just got rid of all the dogs. And I think that the way he did that was the fact that the market was really hot. And, even though it was a dog to him, there was another person willing to pay more for that dog. So I don't know if that's going to happen soon. That might be, a mid-year to a second half to the end of the year type scenario where you start to see a little bit of that. But I just think that there's so much equity out there in these deals now that I just don't know that we're going to see anything like we did in 09 and 10. And the other thing that's funny is, so many of these investors who feel like they missed out in the whole last REO phase, they are primed and ready to go. I mean, it is just like, I get calls every single day going, hey, do you know anything coming? And it's like, yeah, I'll add you to the list. You're like 570th on the list, but I'll get to you someday. So any other questions? Well, great. Well, thank you guys very much.